I feel like with all of the stuff going on with Microsoft, and the Activision Blizzard situation being prolonged even further, potentially even, I don't know, potentially even maybe even extending into next year. I mean, it's such a mess, because I think they're not really going to actually hear anything until, or they're not actually going to be reaching any real critical decision making until like late August, probably something like that. I have a feeling that probably eases the tension on Sony a little bit, in the sense that they don't necessarily have to step on the gas. It's a lot of expenditure to just go out and acquire studios, especially if there's no real reason to. And if Microsoft is in a position where they're kind of in the middle of fighting for this one acquisition, they're not really in a position to acquire anything else, which means, I don't know, in my opinion, I just feel like it's a pretty good time for Sony to just kind of stay still, work on whatever it is they're working on. If they need to maybe build a new studio, maybe do something like that, or maybe like acquire some like support team, something like, I feel like the next Sony acquisition is probably going to be something along the lines of like a Nixus or something like that. Like, not necessarily something like massive. They're not going to acquire like something like People Can Fly. I feel like it's going to be like a largely uninteresting acquisition, at least to like the public. Is that's kind of what I imagine this year is going to be. I don't think there's going to be a lot of acquisition happening.
Yeah, I agree with you in the sense that Sony's got to play it, in my opinion, optically, Sony has to play it very carefully.
Yeah,
because I don't think it's a big deal because they can be like, what the Bungie thing. It's like, are you kidding? No one even bothered to try to draw comparisons between that. Not that there was really a lot of problems at that point anyway, but I don't think they can get into the publisher buying game and not look hypocritical, even if it's a fraction of the cost. I mean, there's just no deal they can make that's anywhere near as big as Activision. And that could be their argument. But I think that they'll realize it may be wiser for them to just stand pat. And Dustin, I'll throw it over to you. I feel like Sony has sufficient resources. We're going to talk about Microsoft in a minute, but I think there's an example with Microsoft's first party of, it's like, well, okay, they have all these resources. They have no games coming out. I mean, there's virtually nothing to speak of over these last few years. So having more resources doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get more games. Using the resources you have wisely and finding those windows to release high quality games is probably more important. So, and I've always been anti-acquisition, so it kind of fits within my philosophy as well. What do you think?
I think that it would be in their best interest to, instead of, like you're saying, going in and acquiring more companies, is to continue making strategic partnerships that make sense. And I think that the where there's smoke, there's fire situation is with Square Enix, specifically in that they have no games coming out on Xbox. They have a game that has a sequel to a game in Octopath Traveler 2, where the original never came out on PlayStation. And yet for some reason, this one's coming out on PlayStation. Something weird is going on with Square Enix. And I'm not saying that PlayStation is buying them, but it seems like there is something going on where either they're maybe an investment, some kind of partnership or something. And I think that makes a lot of sense with Japanese games, I think, just exploding right now, being so incredibly popular. And it makes sense for the platform. It's a natural home for JRPGs and PlayStation. And right now, PlayStation doesn't have any studios making that. They totally shuttered Studio Japan. So really, their Japanese development presence is next to nothing. So if I was in charge at Sony, it would be looking towards bolstering the already established relationships in Japan, and maybe even, I don't know about mergers, but making sure those games are locked in, especially because Xbox has been more aggressive on this front. I don't know if it's an effective strategy for them. Like specifically the Persona games that came out are on Game Pass. They've done stuff with Sega for having the Yakuza games on Game Pass and stuff like that. And even Octopath Traveler, right? So I'm curious though. I think that that's also sticking with partnerships and deals like that is a smarter decision, like you guys were saying, with all the Activision Blizzard shit, where they can continue to lock in exclusives. Again, this is my business hat. Continue to lock in exclusives and reasons to play on PlayStation that will not draw criticism while this deal's going on.
Yeah, the deal won't be resolved, it seems like one way or the other, until late summer at the earliest, based on these timelines with the United States government specifically. There could be concessions made before then that get the deal done, but it doesn't seem like Sony is willing to deal with Microsoft at all, and feels pretty bullish and confident that this isn't going to happen. And yeah, they have to be careful about the like we've put an underline under, is this idea of controversy surrounding hypocritical moves, even if they aren't truly hypocritical, because the scope is so much different. It doesn't really matter. And we see that in politics all the time. If things look similar, then they're going to be similar optically, and you want to avoid that as best you can. But I do think that Sony has totally sufficient resources to make games now, plus some second party relationships. And like you said, I'm glad you brought up Square Enix, because I find that peculiar as well. And I wonder what's going on there. And I think you're right, Dustin. I wouldn't be surprised if Sony said, like, we bought 25% of this, or we bought something of this, or whatever. They've already been doing it. They bought a piece of From Software. They bought a piece of Epic. They bought a piece of Discord. They've gone around and done this and kind of just solidified their appearance as a small-time funder of these operations, plus maybe getting a board seat and all of the rest. And you kind of grow your power like that and create relationships and things like that. So they're extracting games out of China, these random second-party games that are coming. So I think they have sufficient means, and the expansionism is just unfortunate. And I don't support it. I don't want to see it anymore. And the more, well, is this actually something that we're going to talk about? You know what? I'll save it. I'm going to save it. We'll get into the next question right now.
I want to bring up one other thing though.
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
About the Square Enix thing, just because I'm really intrigued by this, is that you have just as a similar example, you have Nintendo. They own a large part of Pokemon, enough that they can say, hey, if you're releasing a console game, it has to be only on Nintendo, right? I wonder if there's some world where Sony owns enough of Square Enix that they can be somewhat independent, and that they can release games on mobile and PC and maybe even some stuff on Switch. But Sony says, yeah, your main console games are only coming to PlayStation. Like, how much would that have to be? And could that be an actual situation that could happen?
Yeah, I mean, it could happen. You'd have to have majority control probably to make that happen. And that could be all it takes. I don't know. There's something obviously going on, but I also draw back to what I was saying about the MPD and obvious lack of game sales on Xboxes. Square Enix could very well just be looking at it and being like, no one is buying games here. Why would we continue to put games out here? I mean, I really do think that I think that there's like some conspiratorial thinking that Sony is like so-called money hatting things. And they certainly are in the AAA space and some certain, notable indies and so on and so forth. But I actually think a lot of it is just straight up crude bean counting of these firms that have experience selling games being like, we have no reason to release a game there. I mean, if we're going to sell a few thousand copies of the game, it's literally not worth it for us to sell it there at that size. And so it could just be that simple. I would, for instance, but people argue it's a vicious cycle because, well, then people are not going to support you. It's like Crisis Core. Crisis Core is not going to sell well on Xbox, but is it not going to sell well on Xbox because Final Fantasy is dead on Xbox? Or is it going to not sell well on Xbox because Square doesn't release games on there? Or is it not going to sell well because Final Fantasy VII Remake's not there? I have no idea. So you can't really get accurate data. But yeah. So I'm just saying that I think Sony, there is some conspiratorial thinking that I think goes a little too far. I actually just think some of it is we don't feel like we need to release things there. And Square Enix might feel that way. I have no idea. It is very conspicuous because it's nothing. Like there's nothing coming. But they might make the argument the biggest games we make are all timed exclusives. Those are the games you would want and we would want to sell there and we can't. So that's just where our hands are tied. So it could be that simple as well. But we'll see.